The year was 1919. The world was still reeling from the aftermath of the First World War. In India, under the yoke of British colonial rule, the winds of unrest were beginning to stir more fiercely than ever. The Indian people had hoped that their significant contributions to the British war effort, both in manpower and resources, would be acknowledged with greater political autonomy. Instead, they were met with disappointment and repression. To quell growing dissent, the British enacted the Rowlatt Act in March 1919. This law allowed the colonial government to imprison any person suspected of terrorism or sedition without trial, effectively stripping citizens of their civil liberties. It was a move that shocked and enraged many Indians, including the likes of Mahatma Gandhi, who had once believed in the justice of British law. Punjab, a province with a strong martial tradition and proud history, was particularly vocal in its resistance. Amritsar, one of its major cities, became a hotbed of political activity. Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satya Pal, two prominent local leaders, were at the forefront, rallying the people against the injustices of colonial rule. On April 10, 1919, Kichlu and Satya Pal were arrested and secretly exiled from the city. News of their arrest spread like wildfire, inciting protests. A peaceful procession that marched to the Deputy Commissioner's residence was fired upon by British troops, killing several demonstrators. In retaliation, angry mobs attacked government buildings and symbols of British authority. The colonial administration, already viewing Punjab as a volatile region, decided to respond with iron-fisted measures. General Reginald Edward Harry Dyer was sent to Amritsar to restore order. He was a man shaped by imperial arrogance and convinced that only a display of absolute force could reinstate British dominance. Dyer imposed martial law without formally declaring it. Public gatherings were banned, and any form of dissent was met with brutal repression. But the spirit of resistance had already taken hold, and the people of Amritsar were not so easily cowed. April 13, 1919, was Baisakhi, a major festival for Sikhs, and a day of celebration for many across Punjab. That afternoon, thousands of men, women, and children gathered at Jallianwala Bagh, a walled garden in the heart of Amritsar. Some came to protest peacefully against the Rowlatt Act and the arrests of Kichlu and Satya Pal, while others came to celebrate Baisakhi. Jallianwala Bagh was enclosed on all sides by tall buildings and walls, with only a few narrow entrances and exits. It was not a place designed for large gatherings, but it had often been used for public meetings. Unknown to the crowd, General Dyer had received intelligence about the meeting. Interpreting it as a defiance of his ban on public assembly, he decided to make an example of those gathered. At around 4:30 p.m., Dyer marched into the garden with a contingent of 50 riflemen armed with 303 Lee Enfield rifles. Without any warning to the crowd, he ordered his troops to block the exits and take positions. Then, with cold detachment, he gave the order to fire. The soldiers began shooting into the dense crowd, aiming for the thickest parts of the gathering. Panic erupted. People screamed and tried to flee, but the few narrow exits were already blocked. Some attempted to climb the walls. Others jumped into a well at the center of the garden to escape the hail of bullets. The well, later known as the Martyrs' Well, claimed many lives as desperate people leapt into it. For 10 horrifying minutes, the gunfire continued. By the time Dyer finally ordered a ceasefire, his men had fired 1,650 rounds. Official British reports claimed 379 people were killed and over 1,200 wounded, though Indian sources estimate the death toll exceeded 1,000. Dyer made no arrangements for the wounded. He simply left the garden, leaving the dead and dying to fend for themselves. Word of the massacre spread quickly. Families searched the garden for loved ones, only to find bodies strewn across the ground. The air was thick with the stench of blood and gunpowder, and the cries of the wounded echoed into the night. The British attempted to justify the massacre. Dyer claimed he had prevented a greater rebellion, portraying himself as a savior of the Raj. Some Britishers in India hailed him as a hero, but many back in Britain were appalled. The Indian response was one of grief, fury, and a newfound resolve. Rabindranath Tagore, India's Nobel laureate in literature, renounced his knighthood. Gandhi launched a full-scale non-cooperation movement, calling for Indians to boycott British institutions. The massacre shattered any illusions of fairness in British rule and radicalized many moderate Indians. It was no longer just a fight for rights within the empire. It became a struggle for complete independence. Under pressure, the British government appointed the Hunter Commission to investigate the incident. While the commission condemned Dyer's actions as excessive, it stopped short of recommending any disciplinary action. Dyer was relieved of command and retired, but he faced no formal punishment. In fact, a fund set up by the Morning Post, a conservative British newspaper, raised over $26,000 as a reward for his service, and he was celebrated by imperial loyalists. To many Indians, the commission was a whitewash. The lack of justice only deepened the wounds. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre became a symbol of colonial cruelty, etched into the national consciousness. The massacre triggered a seismic shift in Indian politics. Leaders who had previously sought compromise with the British began advocating for complete self-rule. The Indian National Congress, which had been largely moderate, adopted a more radical stance. Young leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose were galvanized. The idea that independence could be won through negotiation seemed increasingly implausible. The people of India, united in grief and rage, rallied around the idea of Swaraj, complete self-governance. Gandhi, too, altered his path. Though committed to non-violence, he realized that British rule could not be morally persuaded to relinquish control. The massacre became a moral indictment of the empire and a turning point for the freedom movement. Jallianwala Bagh today stands as a memorial to the martyrs of that fateful day. The bullet marks still visible on the walls, the Martyrs' Well, and the Flame of Liberty monument remind visitors of the price paid for freedom. Each year, thousands visit the site, not only to honor the dead, but to reflect on the resilience of the Indian spirit. The massacre is taught in history books, recounted in documentaries, and memorialized in films and literature. It is not just a story of death and violence, it is a story of awakening, a tragic, painful, but necessary moment that propelled a nation toward its destiny. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre remains one of the darkest chapters in colonial history. It exposed the moral bankruptcy of imperialism and proved that a system built on domination could not be reformed from within. But from the blood-soaked soil of Amritsar rose a tide of resistance that would not be silenced. India would continue its struggle through salt marches, boycotts, imprisonments, and sacrifices until independence was finally achieved in 1947. And though decades have passed, the echoes of that gunfire still resound, a reminder of the cost of freedom, the cruelty of oppression, and the indomitable will of a people determined to be free.